man who
idiots!
was once a prisoner.
They'll see I was right.
Displeased about it, not because he'd been captured, but because too little money had been demanded for him. 20 talents of silver, about half a ton. And the young Roman is genuinely offended. Could he really be worth so little? He demands that his captors raise the price to 50. The pirates laugh and agree. Why not humor the eccentric? A few weeks later, this same man will return for them on ships and crucify every single one of them, carrying out a joke they had mistaken for the whim of a prisoner with an unusual sense of humor. This will not be the only time Gaius Julius Caesar makes those around him wonder whether he's joking, only to then, with cold method, see the matter through to the end. This man, who will make that his trademark, has a debt awaiting him equal to 20 tons of silver, a king whose name will follow him to his dying day, a friend who will once save him from ruin and become his debtor forever, and an adopted son whom he will love more than many of his blood relatives, and who will drive in one of the first blows of the dagger. He will refuse a crown that he wanted more than anyone in Rome had in 500 years, and he will pay for that refusal with his own life, because he will refuse it unconvincingly enough. All of this in order. But the story does not begin with birth or lineage. It begins in the middle of the sea, on the deck of a pirate ship, where a Roman in full dress behaves as though it were his own vessel and not a prison. 76 BCE. 25-year-old Gaius Julius Caesar is sailing to the island of Rhodes to study oratory under the finest rhetoric teachers of the age. Off the coast of Asia Minor, he is intercepted by Cilician pirates, raiders who by this point effectively control the eastern Mediterranean and make their living kidnapping wealthy travelers for ransom. Caesar is taken captive and given a figure, 20 talents of silver. He hears the number and is offended, not frightened, but genuinely offended, as though his fee had been undervalued. He personally insists the ransom be raised to 50 talents, and the pirates, chuckling, agree. What follows is 40-odd days that deserve a film of their own. Caesar behaves not like a captive, but like the owner of the ship who happens to find himself among the servants. He demands quiet when he wants to sleep. He reads the pirates his own speeches and poems, composed on the spot, and grows irritated if the audience isn't sufficiently impressed. He plays dice with his captors, and, most interestingly, every so often, half-jokingly, he promises, "The moment I'm free, I'll crucify every one of you." The pirates laugh. An amusing Roman with an inflated sense of himself. What more can you expect? What must it feel like to demand that your own kidnappers raise the price on your head because the sum on offer strikes you as insultingly modest? The answer to that question is perhaps Caesar's whole character captured in a single scene. A painful vanity multiplied by an absolute conviction that sooner or later the balance of power will tip in his favor. When the ransom finally arrives, the pirates release their prisoner and part with him on almost friendly terms, pleased to have spent their time profitably. But no sooner has Caesar set foot on shore than he hires a squadron at his own expense, puts to sea, finds the very same pirates anchored where he left them. They apparently hadn't even bothered to hide, and takes them all captive himself. He recovers the silver, and then he crucifies the pirates, exactly as promised. The one concession he makes, and it is characteristic in its own way, is that in gratitude for their relatively decent treatment, he orders them strangled first, so that the crucifixion, usually a long and agonizing death, would already be painless for them. the debt is settled in full, with interest and without sentiment. This will be a lifelong pattern. Caesar remembers debts, grievances, and favors alike, with the precision of a bookkeeper. And sooner or later, he settles every account. Sometimes those accounts are, quite literally, money. The family into which Gaius Julius Caesar was born in the year 100 BCE belonged to the very top of the Roman aristocracy, to the patricians, ancient families whose ancestors were believed to have stood at the founding of the city itself. The Julia traced their line further still. Family legend held that their ancestor was the Trojan prince Aeneas, and through him, the goddess of love, Venus herself. It sounds like self-promotion, but by Roman standards, this was close to the norm. Half the noble families traced themselves back to gods or heroes, and no one thought it worth seriously disputing. Religion and family pride went hand in hand in Rome. The future dictator's full name is built like a whole clan's calling card. Gaius is the personal name, something like our first name. Julius is the family, gens name, marking membership in the Julian clan. And Caesar is a hereditary nickname, a cognomen, inherited from some distant ancestor whose origin was already disputed even in Caesar's own lifetime. By one version, some forebear had killed a war elephant in battle, and Caesar supposedly meant elephant in the Carthaginian language. By another, far less heroic version, the ancestor had simply been very hairy, which can't help but amuse, given that Caesar himself spent his whole life painfully self-conscious about his own baldness, at one point combing his thinning hair forward just to hide it. The irony is that a family nickname which originally may have meant something like hairy would become the title of absolute power for 2,000 years to come, from Roman emperors to German Kaisers and Russian Tsars, whose title is the very same word, just spelled through a different alphabet. Caesar's childhood and youth passed without particular upheaval until he turned 16, and then his father died, leaving the son the only adult male in the family. For a Roman, this meant far more than it would for us today. Family, clan, and lineage were not merely a circle of relatives, but effectively a political and economic institution, and the head of the family was answerable, literally, for everything, from the honor of the line to the well-being of dozens of people, from relatives to freedmen and clients. And then it turned out that a fortunate family connection could be deadly. Through his mother's line, Caesar was related to Gaius Marius, an immensely influential politician and general, elected consul 7 times, the pinnacle of a Roman political career. But Marius lost the civil war to his longtime rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who, upon seizing power, turned political revenge into an actual assembly line of terror. He published lists, prescriptions, naming men declared enemies of the state. Their property was confiscated, and they themselves killed without trial, while the informer, who turned in a fugitive, received a share of his estate. Young Caesar, nephew of the defeated Marius, came to the attention of this machine. He was forced into hiding, changing refuges almost nightly, and was ultimately saved by influential family friends who literally begged the dictator for his pardon. Sulla agreed reluctantly, and, according to tradition, uttered a phrase that sounds like a curse. The Roman people would one day regret this decision, for there was too much of Marius in this boy. The ruler, whose name became synonymous with terror, turned out, among other things, to be a rather good prophet. While Sulla lived, there could be no question of a political career. It was far too dangerous to draw attention to oneself as a relative of the defeated enemy. Caesar left for military service, to where the Republic had only just gained a foothold on the coast of present-day Turkey in the province of Asia. He did not sit out the war as a clerk in headquarters. He fought personally, handled himself well in the saddle, was an excellent swordsman, and for saving a Roman citizen's life in battle, received the oak wreath, the civic crown, the Republic's second highest military honor after the very highest. The privileges that this wreath conferred were no small matter. Senators, for instance, were obliged to rise in the presence of a man who had earned it. The young officer gained the right, quite literally, to make venerable old men stand up out of their chairs by his mere arrival. It was during this same military service that Caesar found himself at the court of the local king Nicomedes, negotiating with him on Rome's behalf. And it was from there that a rumor emerged which would follow him almost to his dying day, that the king had supposedly seduced the young Roman officer. Whether this was true or slander from political enemies is impossible to say. No documents survive, only the gossip of contemporaries, who happily kept retelling it decades later, even once Caesar had become dictator. What makes it particularly amusing is that his reputation was exactly the opposite, that of a shameless, insatiable, scandalous womanizer, to the point that his own soldiers, during his triumphal processions, sang openly obscene ditties about their commander. It was believed that such jokes helped ward off the envy of the gods from a man who had grown a little too fortunate. The rumor about Nicomedes remained in the shadow of this far louder reputation, but it never entirely disappeared either. After Sulla's death, Caesar returned to Rome and tried to make a name for himself. He began with lawsuits, suing prominent associates of the late dictator for corruption during his rule. He lost the cases. The connections of Sulla's former henchmen proved stronger than his youthful eloquence. But he did achieve something. He made an impression. The public appreciated his gift for oratory, and Caesar, soberly assessing his own weak points, decided to sharpen them. He set off for Rhodes, to the finest teachers of rhetoric of the age. It was on this very trip that he was captured by the pirates already discussed above. Once freed and having settled accounts with his captors in the only way he knew, with interest, Caesar returned to Rome and stepped onto the first rung of that career ladder the Romans called the path of honor, a rigidly regulated sequence of state offices through which anyone who wished to govern the republic was obliged to pass. First, military tribune, then, by age 30, quaestor, a man investigating criminal cases and managing public funds. At 36, aedile, overseeing city construction and public entertainments. At 39, praetor, effectively supreme judge and chief prosecutor combined. And finally, near the age of 40, the pinnacle of the career, consul, one of the Republic's two highest elected offices. At every rung of this ladder stood an election, and elections in Rome cost money, thoroughly indecent amounts of money. One had to maintain a certain lifestyle, keep a household befitting one's status, host feasts, give gifts to the right people, pay for gladiatorial games to entertain the voting crowd. In essence, buy votes directly or through a dozen intermediaries. Caesar never had money. He borrowed first against the honor of his family name, then against his military reputation, then simply against future prospects, against the promise that it would all pay off one day, before one particularly important vote. He is said to have told his own mother, "Either I come home consul, or I don't come home at all," meaning that he would simply flee his creditors to the far end of the earth. By 61 BCE, Caesar's debts had reached 830 talents, roughly 20 tons of silver. For comparison, the pirates had once demanded a ransom of only 20 talents for the man himself, and he had found the sum so paltry that he took offense and personally insisted it be raised to 50. Now he owed more than 16 times that amount, and not to pirates somewhere out at sea, but to his own creditors, right in the heart of Rome. Creditors who were already literally inventorying his property, preparing to auction it, all off on the eve of his departure as governor to Spain. We will discuss in more detail how Caesar turned his own debts into a political weapon. But it is at exactly this moment, on the verge of total ruin, that a savior appears. Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in the Republic, having grown rich, fittingly enough, on those very same sullen proscriptions that had once forced the young Caesar into hiding to save his own life. While the hunt for men declared outlaws swept across all of Rome, Crassus methodically bought up confiscated villas, lands, and slaves for next to nothing, amassing a fortune that his contemporaries compared only to the wealth of Eastern kings. Now this man steps in as guarantor for the young politician's debts, and from this moment, Caesar finds himself effectively tied to his creditor. He pushes through the Senate laws favorable to tax farmers, a business Crassus had invested heavily in. Consider for a moment, a man whose wealth grew out of terror against Caesar's own family becomes the one who saves him from the debt pit. And Caesar accepts this help without the slightest embarrassment. In his world, money and politics are rarely kept apart by things like personal memories of grievance. Freed from the immediate threat of ruin, Caesar finally departs for Spain as governor. And here, it seems, he first truly develops a taste for real power. He harshly, without much regard for nuance, subdues the local tribes, including ones that had behaved quite neutrally, brings the province to order, and along the way, substantially repairs his own finances through plunder and taxes. On the way there, according to tradition, passing through a backwater village and joking with his companions about its wretchedness, he tosses off a line that would become one of the most quoted in his biography. "I would rather be first here than second in Rome." And it is in Spain itself that a scene worth seeing in full detail takes place. Caesar enters a temple of Hercules and sees there a statue of Alexander the Great. And he sighs. Alexander, at Caesar's current age, had already conquered half the known world, had become a legend in his own lifetime, while Caesar, about to turn 40, is, frankly, still very far from that kind of glory. He is the governor of one province with a mountain of debt at his back, not the ruler of half the world. Though, to be entirely fair, Alexander received his power ready-made, inherited from his father, while all Caesar has inherited is a famous family name and a network of useful connections, which today open doors and tomorrow, under different circumstances, could just as easily land a man on the very same death lists he himself barely escaped as a teenager. Returning from Spain to Rome, Caesar finally settles on the political side he will play for the rest of his life. Roman politics of the time is split into two loose camps. The Optimates, the party of the old nobility, defending the privileges of the aristocracy and the status quo. The Populares, politicians betting on the mood of the common people, on reform, on generous handouts and land redistribution. Caesar, himself a patrician by blood, from a family that traces itself to a goddess, becomes one of the country's finest orators, precisely on the side of the Populares. So much so that even Marcus Tullius Cicero, the acknowledged god of Roman eloquence and a man who leaned rather toward the opposing camp, acknowledges in his rival a genuine gift of persuasion. Caesar has a favorite political trick. When a vote in the Senate stalls and isn't heading the way he wants, an enraged crowd of common people conveniently gathers outside the building. And it is Caesar who goes out to them, to calm them, to reason with them, to diffuse the situation. The senators applaud him for saving the day, sincerely unaware, or perhaps simply unwilling to suspect, that the crowd under their windows was largely organized by the very same man who is now so convincingly pacifying it. Caesar's chief opponent in the Senate becomes Marcus Porcius Cato the Younger, leader of the Senate majority, a stoic philosopher, a fanatical champion of strict morality and old republican values. Cato openly suspects Caesar of dictatorial, if not outright royal ambitions. And this was the worst possible accusation one could level at a man in a city whose national mythology was built on the overthrow of kings 500 years earlier. Cato lives conspicuously modestly, despising all luxury as a sign of moral decay. Caesar, by contrast, dresses ostentatiously expensively, collects jewels and rare, educated slaves, and even brings portable mosaic floors along on his military campaigns. Because even in a tent at the edge of civilization, he wants to walk on marble, not on bare ground. Once, while still deep in debt, builds himself a villa on a lake, but dislikes the result and orders the already completed building torn down and rebuilt from scratch, essentially paying twice for the same structure. The rivalry between these two men is not simply a clash of two political programs, but a collision of two entirely different visions of what a true Roman ought to be. There is a famous episode in which Cato, wanting to derail a vote unfavorable to his party, delivers a speech in the Senate without a single pause for 10 hours straight, talking literally until the session closes, so that the decision simply cannot be reached within the allotted time. That is the kind of stubbornness capable of halting the machinery of state through sheer force of lungs. Caesar builds his next political maneuver with truly bookkeeper-like calculation. He marries his daughter from his first marriage to Gnaeus Pompeius, by this point already nicknamed the Great for his conquest of Spain and much of the Near East, the Republic's most successful general. And at the same time, he reconciles this Pompey with a long-time personal enemy, that very same Crassus who had once pulled him out of the debt pit. Together, the three form an informal alliance that entered history as the First Triumvirate, a rule of three that governs the Republic, effectively bypassing the official state institutions, settling everything behind closed doors, and only afterward dressing the decisions up prettily through the Senate and popular assemblies. Formally, Caesar is the junior and least influential partner in this arrangement. He has neither Crassus's wealth nor Pompey's military glory. But by temperament, he is categorically unwilling to remain in a secondary role for long. In 59 BCE, he finally becomes consul, the summit of the path of honor he had pursued for so many years, and for which he had run up debts equal to 20 tons of silver. And he immediately launches into vigorous populist activity. He pushes through a land reform providing plots for impoverished veterans and the urban poor, and secures expanded citizenship rights for Rome's Italian allies, the two most painful issues in the politics of the day, doing so despite the furious resistance of his fellow consul and the entire Optimate party led by the unyielding Cato. At the end of his consular term, Caesar is given command over vast territories in the north, Gaul and Illyricum, lands in northern Italy, southern present-day France, and the Adriatic coast of the Balkans, and receives them for a full 5 years instead of the usual 2, pushed through the Senate, through the efforts of Crassus and Pompey. Under his command are 4 legions. He raises a 5th himself, at his own expense, a direct investment in the future that, as it will soon turn out, pays off with interest incomparable to any previous loan. The pretext for a full-scale war is quickly found. One Gallic tribe abandons its homeland and begins migrating across a neighbor's territory. The neighbor asks Rome for protection from the first, and Caesar, deftly seizing the opportunity, goes to war against both at once. Thus begins a campaign that will stretch across 8 years and turn a modest politician buried in debt into one of the wealthiest and most beloved by his own army men in the entire history of the Republic. Over these 8 years, Caesar conquers the territory of present-day France and parts of Belgium and Switzerland, carries out punitive expeditions across the Rhine into the depths of Germany, and even crosses the strait into the far-off, semi-legendary, to Romans island of Britain. The strength of his legions lies not only in discipline and morale, though those too, but above all in engineering and logistics honed to perfection. Every evening the soldiers on the march build a fully fortified camp with a ditch and palisade. Every morning they dismantle it completely and carry all their equipment onward on their own shoulders. To the enemy, it began to seem that what was advancing on them each day was not an army, but some kind of migrating fortress, and attacking it at night was simply unthinkable, since the fortification would spring up out of nothing within a few hours. One of the clearest examples of this engineering might is the crossing of the Rhine, a river some 400 meters wide and about 8 meters deep, a formidable barrier even today, and 2,000 years ago it seemed almost insurmountable. The Romans built a full bridge across it in 10 days to contemporaries on both banks of the river. This seemed nothing short of sorcery. An army had simply stepped across a natural boundary that the Germanic tribes had considered impassable by nature itself. Beyond his military talent, Caesar reveals an ability that may prove even more important for his future career. He turns out to be a brilliant writer. He regularly sends to Rome his commentaries on the Gallic War, a strikingly spare, elegant text written by himself about himself, but in the third person, as though narrated by a detached outside observer. The public back in the capital devours these reports. It was believed that over the years of the Gallic campaign, Caesar had killed around 1 million people and enslaved roughly as many again, a figure certainly greatly inflated by propaganda, including his own. But the scale of what was happening was quite real. In these years, the map of Europe was changing before everyone's eyes. At the same time, Caesar knows how, and knows masterfully, to win over his own soldiers. He constantly raises their pay, gives them weapons richly adorned with silver and gold, reasoning quite practically that even the most cowardly soldier is unlikely to abandon so expensive an item on the battlefield. In battle, he stays beside his legionaries rather than behind them on horseback, as was customary among other commanders. Moreover, the horses are deliberately led far to the rear, so that the commander has no physical possibility of fleeing at a critical moment. As the historian Plutarch aptly observed, Caesar somehow managed to buy the most expensive thing in the world for the cheapest price. Through his generosity, he obtained what money alone could never buy directly: the almost religious, fanatical devotion of ordinary soldiers to him personally. rather than to some abstract republic far away in Rome. While Caesar is fighting in the north, the structure of the triumvirate on which his entire political career rested begins to fall apart. Crassus, having set off on an ambitious campaign against the Parthian kingdom in the east, dies along with most of his army in one of the most crushing military defeats in the Republic's history. Caesar's daughter, married off to Pompey, dies in childbirth, and with her disappears the last personal bond holding together the alliance of the two most powerful men in the state. Left without his partner rival, Pompey gradually and ever more openly draws closer to the old aristocracy and personally to Cato. That is, he shifts to the side of the very people he had once counterbalanced together with Caesar. In the next elections, the Conservative Party wins, and the Senate presents its governor in Gaul with an unyieldingly harsh condition: disband your army, resign your powers, return to Rome as a private citizen, and there we will review your conduct and quite possibly call to account all your old debts and grievances along the way. Caesar is categorically unwilling to go to any such review. The balance of power by this point is obvious. Gaul brings him more money every year than he had ever owed in his entire previous life, including those very 20 tons of silver over which his creditors had nearly auctioned off all his property. Under his command are 10 hardened veteran legions devoted to their commander and having never so much as laid eyes on any senator from the distant capital. Of this man, who 10 years earlier had been begging Crassus for a debt guarantee, one can now say with full justice, he alone is richer than the entirety of his former debt-ridden life combined. On the 10th of January, 49 BCE, Caesar, with a single legion, approaches a narrow border stream called the Rubicon. To look at, this river makes no particular impression. Hardly an imposing barrier, nothing like the Rhine his engineers had bridged. But this modest stream marks the boundary of a Roman governor's legal authority. Beyond it begins the actual territory of Italy and the jurisdiction of the Republic, which a military commander is forbidden to enter with troops on pain of being declared an outlaw. Caesar hesitates. His companions later recalled him saying that if he did not cross the river, the trouble would be his alone. But if he did cross, disaster would befall the whole country. And still he crosses, uttering a phrase that people around the world repeat to this day, often without even realizing where it came from. The die is cast. The Republic barely resists. Fortresses along the advancing army's path surrender one after another without a single battle. Garrison soldiers sometimes arrest their own commanders themselves or go over to Caesar's side whole units at a time, weapons and standards included. He advances on the capital with staggering speed, from crossing the Rubicon in early January to Pompey's flight overseas to Greece, barely more than 2 months pass. This is partly a brilliant military campaign, but partly no less brilliant public relations. Caesar executes none of the captured enemy, lets those wishing to join Pompey go free in all directions, generously buys the loyalty of key provincial governors with money and promises, and publicly declares that everyone who remains neutral in this war is his friend. Pompey, by contrast, declares as enemies everyone who does not openly take his side. And this difference in rhetoric works more strongly in Caesar's favor than any battle could. On the very day the news of the Rubicon crossing reaches Rome, Cato demonstratively dons mourning clothes right in the middle of the forum. "Whom are you mourning?" asks the puzzled passers-by. "My dead fatherland," he answers. At the decisive Battle of Pharsalus in Greece, Pompey has a numerical advantage in cavalry, but this cavalry is made up largely of young aristocrats, for many of whom the coming battle will be their first ever. And Caesar gives his soldiers an unusual order: to aim their spears not at the horses' legs, as was customary, but directly at the riders' faces. The prospect of disfiguring wounds for life apparently terrifies these pampered young men even more than death itself in battle. The cavalry breaks into panicked flight, dragging the rest of Pompey's army along with it. Pompey himself flees by sea to Egypt, hoping to find refuge at the local royal court, but arriving in Alexandria in pursuit, Caesar finds his former son-in-law and longtime rival already dead. Local courtiers, eager to ingratiate themselves as quickly and as spectacularly as possible with the obvious victor of the war, present Caesar with Pompey's severed head as a gift, a token of loyalty to the new master of the situation. Contrary to the Egyptians' expectations, Caesar is genuinely shocked and grieved. Apparently, he had truly respected this man, and perhaps still held in mind some scenario of reconciliation after the war, and he buries his former rival's remains with full military honors. Cato, attempting to organize a last pocket of resistance in North Africa, upon learning of Caesar's inexorably approaching forces, spends his final evening reading Plato's philosophical treatise on the immortality of the soul, retains complete composure, utters the phrase, "Now I am master of my own fate," and stabs himself with his own sword in his chambers. By the standards of his own philosophy, Stoicism, this is an ideal, almost exemplary death of a free man who refused to live under another's power. Symbolically, the old Roman Republic, in the form it had existed for 500 years, dies together with Cato on that day. What follows is an entirely new era, and very soon this will become obvious to everyone. Caesar returns to Rome a triumphator in the most literal sense of the word, a ceremonial procession through the whole city, a purple toga, a gilded chariot, captives and trophies put on display. And for the first time in the Republic's history, he celebrates an actual triumph for a victory over fellow Romans in a civil war. Previously, this had been considered simply improper, since a triumph traditionally required a victory over a foreign enemy. Ahead of the procession is carried a placard bearing an inscription that would become a catchphrase for 2,000 years to come. "I came, I saw, I conquered." Next, he receives the office of dictator. In the structure of the classical republic, this had been a strictly temporary position, introduced only in cases of acute emergency, and usually limited to a few months. Caesar, however, receives this office for life, which effectively erases the very idea of temporariness from the definition of the word itself. In Egypt, where the local monarch is regarded almost as a living god, Alexander the Great himself had been officially worshipped there as a deity in his time. Caesar, having finally matched his longtime idol at the age of 54, is clearly taken with this Eastern idea and begins, gradually but with clear purpose, to prepare his own deification while still alive. He builds a lavish temple in honor of Venus, that same goddess from whom, according to family legend, his entire line descended. He secures the renaming of the month of Quintilis in his own honor, the very month we today call July, without ever thinking about where the name came from. He constantly, on any occasion and none at all, wears the purple toga and laurel wreath of a triumphator, as though he never takes off his parade uniform. He stages gladiatorial games of unprecedented scale and splendor, including an actual naval battle in a specially dug and flooded artificial pool. a spectacle the capital had never before seen. Through all of this, he stubbornly and very deliberately refuses the actual title of king, vain beyond measure, yet calculating enough to understand that this city cannot tolerate kings on an almost biological level, regardless of how convenient a ruler any given claimant might turn out to be. He brings the Egyptian queen Cleopatra to Rome and openly lives with her while his lawful wife is still alive, raises their son together, named Caesarion, whom he is clearly grooming as an heir, and, by some accounts, even works on a law that would formally permit him multiple wives, supposedly purely for reasons of state, to reliably secure heirs for the stability of the realm. For all this evident pull toward Eastern luxury and semi-divine status, Caesar turns out, surprisingly, to be a remarkably capable and hard-working ruler. He plans to build in Rome an enormous public library modeled on the famous one in Alexandria. He reforms the state calendar, and that very familiar calendar of 365 days and 12 months, which the whole world still uses today, is, quite literally, his personal achievement. His contemporaries are astonished by his phenomenal capacity for work. Even back in Gaul, he was known for being able to handle several matters at once, reviewing documents during gladiatorial fights and theatrical performances, dictating letters and speeches to several scribes simultaneously, all on the fly. Cato once remarked sarcastically that only Caesar was capable of staging a coup while remaining perfectly sober. And this was almost literally true. He drank almost nothing at all. Nicomedes would be brought up against him for the rest of his life, and we have already returned to that story. But another man whom Caesar would once forgive and draw close to himself would play a far more tragic role in his fate. In Rome, despite all the reforms and the lifelong dictatorship, a Republican opposition survives, though noticeably weakened. Its informal leaders considered to be two men, Gaius Cassius and Marcus Junius Brutus. Both had at one time fought against Caesar on Pompey's side. Both had been magnanimously forgiven after his victory and drawn into his circle. Caesar was in fact known for the rare practice, for the time, of forgiving former enemies rather than executing them. When one of his advisors once warns the dictator that certain associates seem unreliable, he answers almost dismissively, "It is quite different people one should be wary of." Persistent rumors circulated that Brutus's mother had once been the young Caesar's lover, and that Brutus himself might even be his biological son. It is impossible now either to prove or disprove this. No documents survive, only the gossip of contemporaries. But the fact remains that Caesar treats Brutus with exceptional warmth, almost paternally, and even seriously considers him one of the possible heirs to his power. The trouble lies elsewhere, in the family legend of Brutus's own line. According to tradition, one of his distant ancestors had once overthrown the last Roman king, giving rise to the Republic itself, while another became famous for killing a politician who had tried to make himself king. The young Brutus is enormously popular among Rome's gilded youth, effectively their informal leader. And this same youth expects of him exactly what his legendary ancestors were famous for. Anonymous notes begin appearing for him in the Senate, along the lines of, "You are no true Brutus. Real Bruti kill tyrants." In January of 44, BCE, a conspiracy takes shape. On the 15th of March, immediately after a session of the Senate, Caesar is surrounded by several dozen men. The conspirators, one after another, draw daggers hidden beforehand under their togas and deal the descendant of the goddess Venus 23 stab wounds. At first, He does not even try to fight back seriously, but on seeing Brutus among his killers, he cries out something like, "You too, my child," a phrase that would later be reshaped into the famous "Et tu, Brute." As he dies, he makes only one last movement, pulling a fold of his toga over his head so that no one would see his face after death. By a strange twist of fate, the Senate session that fateful day was being held in a theatre once built by Pompey himself, that same rival whose statue Caesar had once ordered restored as a gesture of reconciliation with his memory. And the mortally wounded dictator falls precisely at the foot of that marble statue, splattering it with his own blood. The conspirators, at first, don't even think to hide. They stride through the city with bloody daggers held high, sincerely expecting the people of Rome to hail them as heroes who had saved the Republic from a tyrant. "Who mourns here for the fatherland?" Cato had asked about himself years earlier. And now his killers expected to receive much the same honors for saving that same fatherland. But it quickly becomes clear that the people are anything but on their side. An enraged crowd spontaneously gathers in the city center, sets fire to Pompey's theater, where the murder took place, and Caesar's body is carried out onto the forum and cremated on the spot. And into this funeral pyre, in some collective frenzy, the Romans begin throwing literally everything within reach: garden benches, market stalls, entire tables from the nearby marketplace. A funeral fit not for a deposed tyrant, but for a living god. When the will is read out a little later, it turns out that Caesar had managed to pull off a truly royal gesture, even from beyond the grave. To every Roman citizen without exception, he left 300 sesterces, a sum roughly equal to a rank-and-file legionary's annual pay. A man who had just been stabbed 23 times in the middle of the Senate chamber still managed to turn his own death into a gift for hundreds of thousands of people he had never personally met. And so, the whole story closes into a kind of circle, full of irony. A man who owed his life to the relative leniency of pirates would later coldly crucify those very same men, having warned them in advance and carrying out the threat word for word. A champion of the common people, who spent his whole life fighting the dominance of the old nobility, ends his life as a claimant to royal power. The very power the Romans hated on the level of a national instinct. An adopted son whom he genuinely loved and magnanimously forgave after the Civil War strikes one of the first blows, and the defeated, humiliated Republic ends up burying him with far greater splendor than it would ever have buried an officially recognized king, the very title he had refused again and again throughout his life, but evidently not convincingly enough to persuade those who had hidden a sharpened dagger beneath their togas.